A cold rain hammered the city streets, turning the pavement into a mirror that reflected the neon signs and the desperation of those who walked beneath them. In a forgotten alley, where the light barely reached and hope seemed like a distant memory, a man named Finn stood at the crossroads of his life. His hands trembled, not from the cold, but from the weight of what he was about to do. Before him stood an elderly woman, serene and still, her white cane resting gently against her side. She was blind, vulnerable, an easy target, but as Finn raised his voice to demand her purse, something inexplicable happened. The woman turned her face toward him, and though her eyes could not see, they seemed to pierce through the darkness, through his fear, through his very soul. In that moment, suspended between desperation and grace, Finn had no idea that he was about to witness something that would change his life forever. What would you do when desperation pushes you to the edge, and you come face to face with an innocence you cannot break? Let us know your thoughts in the comments and tell us which city you're watching from. And if you believe that hope can be found in the most unexpected places, subscribe to our channel so you don't miss what happens next. The city never sleeps, they say, but it does forget. It forgets the people who fall through the cracks, the ones who lose everything in the blink of an eye, the ones who wake up one morning to find that the world has moved on without them. Finn had been one of those people. Just 6 months ago, he had been a different man. He had worked as a line supervisor at a manufacturing plant, a job that wasn't glamorous but paid the bills and gave him dignity. He had a small apartment in a decent neighborhood, nothing fancy, but it was home. And most importantly, he had his daughter Emma, a bright 7-year-old girl with her mother's smile and a laugh that could light up the darkest room. But then the plant closed. Budget cuts, they said. Restructuring. The corporate language that translates to ordinary people losing their livelihoods. Finn had tried to find another job, but every door closed in his face. His savings evaporated like morning mist. The rent went unpaid for 1 month, then 2, then 3. The eviction notice came on a Tuesday, delivered by a sheriff who couldn't meet his eyes. Within a week, Finn and Emma were living in his car, a beaten sedan that rattled with every turn. Emma's mother had left them years ago, unable to handle the responsibility of motherhood. It had always been just the two of them, and Finn had promised himself he would give his daughter a good life. Now, as he watched her sleep, curled up in the back seat, wrapped in every blanket they owned, he felt like he had broken the only promise that mattered. 3 days ago, Emma had developed a fever. It started as a small thing, barely noticeable, but it had grown steadily worse. Finn knew she needed medicine, probably antibiotics, but the free clinic had a 2-week waiting list, and the emergency room would generate bills he could never pay. He had spent his last $7 on children's fever reducer from the dollar store, but it wasn't enough. Emma's forehead burned to the touch, and her coughs echoed in the confined space of the car, each one a dagger to his heart. That's when the desperate thoughts began. Finn had never stolen anything in his life. He had been raised by a grandmother who taught him that character was the only thing a poor person could truly own, and he had believed that with every fiber of his being. But as he held his daughter's small, feverish hand and listened to her labored breathing, those values seemed like luxuries he could no longer afford. The fever reducer would only last another day, maybe 2. After that, what would happen? Would he watch his daughter get sicker and sicker while he did nothing? The thought that entered his mind felt like a violation of everything he was, but it wouldn't leave. One quick grab, someone who wouldn't fight back. Just enough to get the medicine Emma needed. He would pay it back someday, he told himself, when he got back on his feet. It wouldn't really be stealing, it would be borrowing. These were the lies desperate people tell themselves when they're about to cross a line they can never uncross. Tonight, after making sure Emma was as comfortable as possible in the car, Finn had walked the streets of the city's rougher neighborhoods, looking for an opportunity, hating himself with every step. The rain that fell seemed appropriate, as if the sky itself was weeping for what he was about to become. That's when he saw her. The woman moved slowly through the rain-slicked streets, her white cane sweeping before her in careful arcs. She was elderly, perhaps in her 70s, dressed in a simple navy coat that had seen better years. Her white hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and she wore dark glasses despite the late hour. Everything about her screamed vulnerability. Everything about her said easy target. Finn's heart began to race. His mouth went dry. He followed her from a distance, his mind a battlefield between the man he had been and the man he was about to become. She turned into an alley, a shortcut perhaps, or maybe just a wrong turn. The alley was narrow, barely wide enough for a delivery truck, with high brick walls on either side. The neon glow from the street barely penetrated its depths. This was it. This was his moment. His daughter's face flashed in his mind, her fevered sleep, her small body shivering despite the blankets. He clenched his fists and walked faster, his footsteps echoing off the wet pavement. The woman stopped about halfway down the alley, as if she had been expecting him. She turned slowly, her face directed toward him with an uncanny precision for someone who couldn't see. Finn's breath came in short gasps now, his adrenaline surging. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a piece of wood he had found earlier, shaped roughly like a weapon. It was a pathetic thing, but in the darkness it might be enough to intimidate. He raised his voice, trying to sound threatening, trying to be someone he wasn't. "Don't move," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "Just give me your purse and I won't hurt you." The woman, whose name was Alara, though Finn didn't know that yet, did not scream. She did not fumble for her purse with shaking hands. She did not beg or plead or promise not to tell anyone. Instead, she simply stood there, rain dripping from her dark glasses, and said in a voice so calm, it seemed to come from another world entirely, "You sound like you're in a great deal of pain, young man." Finn froze. Of all the responses he had imagined, this wasn't one of them. He had expected fear, compliance, maybe even defiance, but compassion, understanding. It disarmed him completely. "I said give me your purse," he repeated, but the aggression had leaked out of his voice. He sounded tired now, defeated. Ilara tilted her head slightly, as if listening to something beyond his words. "What is her name?" she asked softly. "What?" Finn's confusion was total. "Your daughter," Ilara said. "The one you're doing this for. What is her name?" Finn felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. How could she possibly know? He had said nothing about Emma. For a moment, wild thoughts raced through his mind. Was this some kind of trap? Was this woman not what she seemed? "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, but his voice betrayed him, shaking with emotion. "You can lie to me," Ilara said gently, "but you cannot lie to yourself. I may not be able to see with these eyes, but I can see what matters. I can see a good man who has been pushed to the edge. I can see a father who would do anything for his child, and I can see that you are not a criminal, not yet, but you are standing on a very dangerous precipice." Something inside Finn began to crack. The wall he had built around his emotions, the armor he had worn to get himself to this moment, started to crumble. His hand holding the makeshift weapon dropped slightly. "She's sick," he heard himself say, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. "She has a fever, and she needs medicine, and I don't have any money, and the clinics all have waiting lists, and I don't know what else to do. I don't know what else to do." The admission hung in the air between them, and Finn realized he was crying, his tears mixing with the rain on his face. As he spoke, something extraordinary happened. A gust of wind suddenly swept through the alley, strong enough that Finn had to take a step back to keep his balance. But as he watched in disbelief, he realized that while the wind pushed against him, making his jacket flap wildly and his hair whip across his face, Ilara stood completely still. Her coat didn't move. Her hair remained perfectly in place. The rain around her seemed to pause, as if she existed in a different space under different physical laws. Finn blinked hard, thinking it must be a trick of the light, or his stressed mind playing games with him. But no, there it was again, another gust, and once again it affected only him. His heart began to pound for a different reason now, not from aggression, but from a dawning sense that something impossible was happening. "The world has taken much from you," Ilara said, her voice cutting through the wind that wasn't touching her. "It has taken your job, your home, your sense of security. It has pushed you into corners and given you choices that aren't really choices at all. But listen to me carefully, young man. The world has not taken your heart. The world has not taken your soul. The world has not taken the love you have for your daughter. Do not give those things away so easily. Do not trade them for temporary solutions that will cost you everything that truly matters." Finn stood frozen, the piece of wood still in his hand but forgotten now. Every word Ilara spoke seemed to resonate in his chest like the notes of a deep bell. "You don't understand," he said weakly. "You don't know what it's like to watch your child suffer and not be able to help. You don't know what it's like to feel completely powerless." "Don't I?" Ilara asked, and for the first time there was a note of something ancient in her voice, something that spoke of experiences far beyond what her appearance suggested. "You think suffering is unique to you. You think desperation is a private torment. Every soul on this earth has faced darkness. Every heart has been tested. The question is not whether we face these trials, but how we face them. Do we let them transform us into something we're not, Or do we hold on to who we are even when it would be easier to let go? Finn wanted to be angry at her words, wanted to reject them as the naive philosophy of someone who had never truly struggled, but he couldn't. Something in her voice, in her presence, in the impossible stillness that surrounded her, made it clear that she spoke from a depth of experience he couldn't fathom. "I'm not a bad person," he said, and it sounded like a plea, like he was asking her to confirm it, to tell him it was still true. "No," Ilara agreed, "you're not. But you're about to make a choice that will change that. And once that choice is made, once you cross that line, you can never fully come back. You'll get what you think you need in this moment, but you'll lose something far more valuable. You'll lose the ability to look your daughter in the eyes and know that you're the man she believes you to be. Children are wise in ways we forget as we grow older. They can see the truth in us. Will you be able to bear her looking at you and seeing what you've become?" The words hit Finn like physical blows. He thought of Emma, of the way she looked at him with such complete trust, such absolute faith, that her daddy would always do the right thing, would always protect her, would always be her hero. What would happen to that faith if he did this? Even if she never found out about this specific moment, wouldn't she sense the change in him? Wouldn't she see that something fundamental had shifted? For several long moments, the only sound was the rain falling on the pavement. Finn looked at Ilara, this strange, impossible woman who stood in the alley like a rock in a river, unmoved by the currents that battered everyone else. He felt something he hadn't felt in months, a tiny spark of hope that maybe there was another way, a path he hadn't seen because he had been too consumed by desperation to look for it. But then, from somewhere in the distance, came the sound that changed everything. A siren, police, and it was getting closer. Panic flooded Finn's system like ice water. In seconds, every rational thought, every moment of connection with Ilara, every spark of hope evaporated. All he could think was that he had seconds, maybe less, to make a choice. If the police found him here, in this alley with this woman holding even a fake weapon, his life would be over. He would be arrested, charged, and even if the charges didn't stick, he would have a record. He would never be able to get a legitimate job again. Emma would end up in foster care. Everything would be lost. But if he acted now, if he just grabbed the purse and ran before the police car reached this street, he could get away. He could get the medicine Emma needed. He could disappear into the night, and no one would ever know. The image of his daughter filled his mind. Her small face flushed with fever, her eyes bright with sickness, her trust in him absolute. She needed him. She needed him to do whatever it took. What kind of father would he be if he let his pride, his morals, stand between his daughter and the help she desperately needed? The siren grew louder. Time was running out. Finn made his decision. He lunged forward, reaching for Ilara's purse, the piece of wood raised to intimidate her into compliance. His rational mind screamed at him to stop, but his desperate mind, the part that had been ground down by months of suffering and fear, had taken control. As he moved, as his fingers reached out to grab the strap of her purse, he made the mistake of looking directly at her face. He looked into her eyes, or rather, at the dark glasses that covered them, and everything changed. The glasses, solid and opaque a moment before, suddenly became transparent, as if they had turned to clear glass or simply ceased to exist. And what Finn saw behind them made him forget the siren, forget the purse, forget everything except the overwhelming impossibility of what his eyes were showing him. Ilara's eyes were not the milky, unfocused eyes of the blind. They were not eyes at all, not in any way Finn understood. They were windows into something vast and incomprehensible, swirling galaxies of light, stars being born and dying, nebulae of colors that had no names in human language. It was as if he was looking not at a person, but through a person into the entire universe. But it wasn't just a visual experience. As Finn stared into those impossible eyes, visions flooded his mind with a force that made him stagger. He saw Emma, but not as she was now, sick and suffering in the back seat of a car. He saw her healthy, laughing, running through a park with her arms spread wide like she was trying to hug the whole world. He saw himself, but different, older, wearing a smile he thought he had forgotten how to make. He was standing in front of a building, and above the door was a sign that read, "Second Chances Shelter." He was shaking hands with people, helping them, guiding them, being for them what someone had been for him. He saw a future, not his current trajectory toward desperation and crime, but a different path, one filled with purpose and peace and redemption. He saw it so clearly it felt more real than the alley around him, more real than the rain, more real than anything he had ever experienced. But more than the visions, more than the impossible light, what overwhelmed Finn was the emotion that came with it. It was love, but not the kind he had known. It was unconditional, absolute, infinite. It was the love of a parent for a child, multiplied by eternity. It was acceptance so complete that every mistake he had ever made, every failure, every moment of weakness, was seen and understood and forgiven. He felt it wash over him like a tidal wave, stripping away all his defenses, all his rationalizations, all his desperation, leaving only the core of who he really was, who he had always been, who he could still choose to be. It was too much. The human mind is not built to contain such experiences. Finn recoiled as if he had been struck by lightning, stumbling backward, his legs giving out beneath him. He fell to his knees on the wet pavement, the piece of wood clattering away across the alley floor. His hands came up to cover his face, and he sobbed. Great heaving sobs that came from somewhere so deep inside him he didn't know that place existed. He wept for everything he had lost, for the desperation that had driven him to this moment, for the line he had almost crossed, for his daughter and her fever and her trust in him. But most of all, he wept because for one impossible moment he had seen himself as he truly was, not as the world had made him, not as his circumstances had defined him, but as something more, something valuable, something worthy of that infinite love he had felt. The siren that had been approaching reached its peak and then began to fade. The police car sped past the mouth of the alley without slowing, racing toward whatever emergency had called it, completely unaware of the greater miracle that had just occurred in the shadows. Finn knelt there, his body shaking, his face wet with tears and rain, and felt a presence beside him. Ilara had moved, though he hadn't heard her approach. Her hand, weathered and gentle, rested on his head like a benediction. "Go and be the man your daughter already thinks you are," she said softly. Her voice was just a voice now, human and kind, but Finn would never forget what he had seen, what he had felt, what he had been shown. Ilara's hand lifted from his head, and he heard the soft tap of her white cane as she began to walk away. Finn looked up, his vision blurred by tears, and watched her silhouette disappear into the rain-soaked street beyond the alley. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. Whatever impossible thing she was, whatever she had done, the message had been delivered, and now it was up to him what he did with it. For a long time, Finn stayed on his knees in that alley, the rain soaking through his clothes, his mind struggling to process what had happened. Part of him wanted to believe it had been a hallucination, a stress-induced breakdown, but he knew better. What he had experienced was more real than reality, more true than truth. He had been given a gift, a vision of what could be, and a warning about what would be lost if he chose the wrong path. Finally, as his breathing steadied and his tears slowed, Finn stood up. His legs felt weak, but they held him. He looked around the alley, at the brick walls and the wet pavement and the scattered litter, and it all seemed different now, charged with a significance he couldn't quite articulate. This was the place where his life had split into two possible paths, and by some grace he didn't understand, he had been shown both before having to choose. He walked out of the alley, not toward his car, but toward a building he had passed 100 times without really seeing. It was a shelter, one of the few in the city that also offered comprehensive services, job training, medical care, counseling. Finn had avoided it out of pride, out of a stubborn belief that he could handle things on his own, that asking for help was a form of weakness. Now, standing before its doors, he realized that pride was a luxury he couldn't afford, and that real strength was knowing when to accept the help that was offered. The doors were still open despite the late hour. A man sat at a desk just inside, middle-aged and kind-eyed, wearing a volunteer badge. He looked up as Finn entered, taking in his soaked clothes, his red-rimmed eyes, the obvious distress he was carrying. "Can I help you?" the man asked, his voice free of judgment. Finn opened his mouth to speak and found the words harder than he expected. "I need help," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "My daughter is sick, and I don't have money for medicine, and we've been living in my car, and I almost did something terrible tonight. I almost became someone I'm not, and I need help." The admission was like lancing a wound. The shame of it, the vulnerability, the acceptance of his own powerlessness, it all came pouring out, and Finn felt lighter for it, as if he had been carrying a weight he hadn't known was there. The man stood up immediately, coming around the desk with a practiced kindness. "You came to the right place," he said. "We have a medical professional on site tonight, and we can get your daughter looked at right away." "How old is she?" 7, Finn managed. Her name is Emma. Within the hour, Emma was examined by a nurse practitioner who confirmed what Finn had feared. She had developed a bacterial infection that was causing the fever. The nurse wrote a prescription and handed it to Finn along with vouchers for the medication that would ensure he could get it filled immediately at a 24-hour pharmacy nearby. She also gave him instructions for care, a follow-up appointment card, and a gentle reminder that he had done the right thing by bringing Emma in. Over the next few days, as Emma recovered and regained her strength, Finn and his daughter stayed at the shelter. He participated in the programs they offered: job readiness training, resume building, interview preparation. The shelter had connections with employers who were willing to give people a second chance, and within 2 weeks, Finn had 3 job interviews lined up. The first interview was for a position at a warehouse, loading and unloading trucks. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest work with decent pay and benefits. Finn sat across from the hiring manager, a stern-looking woman who had seen hundreds of applicants just like him, and told her the truth. He told her about losing his job, about the eviction, about living in his car with his daughter. He didn't tell her about the alley and the angel and the vision, but he told her that he had reached a breaking point and had chosen to ask for help instead of making a terrible mistake. He told her that he was a good worker, reliable and honest, and that he just needed someone to give him a chance to prove it. The woman studied him for a long moment, and Finn braced himself for the rejection he had received so many times before. But then she nodded slowly. "Everyone deserves a second chance," she said. "The question is what they do with it. Can you start Monday?" Finn felt tears prick his eyes, but he blinked them back and nodded. "Yes," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Yes, I can start Monday. Thank you. Thank you so much." Monday came and Finn showed up an hour early, ready to work harder than he had ever worked in his life. The job was physically demanding, but he welcomed it. Every box he lifted, every truck he loaded, felt like an act of redemption, a brick in the foundation of the new life he was building. His co-workers noticed his dedication, his willingness to take on the hardest tasks, his perpetual positive attitude despite the grueling work. Within a month, the floor supervisor pulled him aside and offered him a team leader position. Within 6 months, he was being trained in logistics management. Emma thrived too, with stable housing through the shelter's transitional living program and eventually a small apartment Finn could afford on his new salary. She returned to school and threw herself into her studies. The experience of homelessness had left its mark on her, had made her more empathetic, more aware of the struggles others faced. She started a food drive at her school, collecting canned goods for families who were going through what she and her father had gone through. But for Finn, the job and the apartment and the stability, as wonderful as they were not enough. He couldn't forget that night in the alley, couldn't forget the grace that had been shown to him, couldn't forget the vision of the future he had been given. In that vision, he had been standing in front of a shelter, helping others. It had seemed like an impossible dream at the time, but now, with his life rebuilt, it began to feel like a calling, a destiny he needed to pursue. He started small. On weekends, he volunteered at the shelter that had saved him, helping with intake, talking to new arrivals, offering the kind of understanding that could only come from someone who had been exactly where they were. He shared his story, carefully and humbly, emphasizing not his near mistake but the choice he had made to accept help, to believe in the possibility of redemption. People responded to his authenticity. They saw in him not someone who was preaching from a place of superiority, but someone who had walked through the fire and come out the other side. He became known among the shelter residents as someone you could talk to, someone who understood, someone who believed in second chances because he had lived one. Years passed. Emma graduated from high school with honors and went to college on a scholarship, determined to study social work so she could help families like hers had been helped. Finn continued to work, continued to volunteer, continued to feel that pull towards something more. Then, one evening, the director of the shelter called him into his office. The man was retiring, he explained, moving to be closer to his grandchildren. The board had been discussing who should take over, who had the vision and the passion and the understanding necessary to lead the organization into the next chapter. They had unanimously agreed on Finn. "You've lived our mission," the director said. "You know what it's like to need help and what it means to receive it. You know how to meet people where they are without judgment. And everyone who works here, staff and volunteers alike, respects you tremendously. This place changed your life, now you can help it change others." Finn accepted, though he felt overwhelmed by the responsibility. His first few months as director were challenging. filled with administrative tasks and funding concerns, and the endless complex problems that came with trying to help people in crisis. But he approached every challenge with the same determination he had brought to every other aspect of his rebuilt life, and slowly he found his footing. Under his leadership, the shelter expanded its services. They added more comprehensive medical care, partnered with local businesses to create job pipelines, established a childcare program so parents could attend job training, and created a mentorship system where people who had successfully transitioned out of the shelter could come back and guide those just beginning their journey. Finn became known in the community not just as the director of a shelter, but as an advocate for the homeless, a voice for those who had been forgotten. He spoke at city council meetings, lobbied for policy changes, raised funds from sources that had never considered supporting such work before. He told his story over and over, though he never mentioned the supernatural aspect of that night in the alley. That was private, sacred, his own personal miracle that he held close to his heart. But he spoke about desperation, about the razor's edge between survival and destruction, about how close anyone could come to losing themselves when pushed to the brink. He spoke about the importance of compassion over judgment, of seeing the person behind the circumstances, of believing in the possibility of change. Every person he helped, every life that turned around because of the programs he had built, felt like an echo of the grace that had been shown to him. One day, about 5 years into his tenure as director, Finn was walking through the old neighborhood where his life had fallen apart, where he had spent those desperate nights sleeping in his car with Emma. He wasn't sure why he had come back. Perhaps it was a form of pilgrimage, a way of honoring how far he had traveled. He passed the building where he had been evicted, now renovated and rented to people who had no idea of the story it held. He passed the corner store where he had bought that last box of fever reducer with his last few dollars. And then, almost without thinking, his feet carried him to the alley. It looked different in daylight, smaller and less imposing than it had seemed that rainy night. The brick walls were tagged with graffiti now, and someone had left a pile of cardboard boxes near the entrance. But as Finn stood at the mouth of that alley, he could feel it all coming back, the fear, the desperation, the moment of choice, and the impossible miracle that had saved him. He walked slowly into the alley, retracing the steps he had taken that night. About halfway down, he stopped at the place where he thought it had happened, where he had fallen to his knees and wept. The pavement was dry now, marked with oil stains and scattered trash, but to Finn, it was sacred ground. As he stood there, lost in memory, his foot kicked something small that skittered across the pavement. He looked down and saw a piece of dark glass, roughly the size of his thumb, smooth-edged and oddly symmetrical. He bent to pick it up, curious, and held it up to examine it. It was just glass, dark brown or black, the kind that might have broken off a bottle, but as he tilted it toward the afternoon sun, something extraordinary happened. The light hit the glass and refracted through it in a way that seemed to defy physics. Instead of a simple shine or glare, the light exploded into a brilliant star-like pattern, with rays shooting out in perfect symmetry like a supernova captured in miniature. Finn gasped, turning the glass slowly, watching the pattern shift and dance but never lose its essential structure. It looked exactly like the stars and galaxies he had seen in Ilara's eyes, a perfect echo of that impossible moment. He knew with a certainty that went beyond logic that this piece of glass had been here that night, perhaps had always been here, waiting for him to return and find it. It was a sign, a reminder, a physical connection to the spiritual experience that had changed everything. Finn closed his hand around the glass, feeling its smooth edges, its unexpected warmth. He would keep it, he decided. He would carry it with him always as a reminder of where he had been and where grace had carried him. And he would look at it whenever he felt overwhelmed by the work, whenever he encountered a person who seemed too far gone to save, whenever he doubted whether any of it made a difference. He slipped the piece of glass into his pocket and walked out of the alley, his step lighter than it had been when he entered. The past was behind him, but it was no longer a weight he carried. It was a foundation he stood on, a story of transformation that gave meaning to everything he did now. Back at the shelter, Finn had the piece of glass mounted in a small display case that he kept on his desk. He didn't tell anyone what it was or where it came from, but when people asked about it, which they often did because of its unusual ability to refract light in that star-like pattern, he would smile and say, "It's a reminder that light can be found anywhere, even in the darkest places, if we're willing to look for it." Emma, now a social worker herself and working alongside her father at the shelter, understood its significance without needing to be told. She had been too young to remember much of that period, but she carried her own memories of her father's transformation, of the moment their lives began to turn around. When she looked at the glass, she saw not just its physical beauty, but the metaphor it represented, that broken things could still carry light, that what seemed like fragments could contain galaxies, that redemption was always possible. Over the years, Finn helped hundreds of people rebuild their lives. Some were easy cases, people who just needed a temporary hand up, a place to stay while they got back on their feet. Others were far more complicated, carrying the weight of addiction, mental illness, trauma, criminal records, all the tangled circumstances that make escaping poverty and homelessness seem impossible. But Finn approached each person with the same philosophy. Everyone deserved to be seen, to be treated with dignity, to be given a real chance at change. He often thought about Ilara, the mysterious woman in the alley. He had never seen her again, despite keeping an eye out for years in the neighborhoods where homeless people and those in need congregated. Sometimes he wondered if she had been a real person at all or something else, an angel in human form sent specifically to save him from himself. He didn't have an answer, and eventually he realized it didn't matter. Real or supernatural, the encounter had been genuine. The grace had been real, and the change it had wrought in him was undeniable. On the 10th anniversary of the shelter under his leadership, the board threw a celebration. There were speeches and awards, and people who Finn had helped over the years came to share their own stories of transformation. They spoke about the moment they had walked through the shelter doors, broken and hopeless, and how Finn's belief in them had helped them believe in themselves. They talked about the practical help, the job training and medical care and housing assistance, but mostly they talked about how Finn had made them feel seen, valued, worthy of redemption. When it was Finn's turn to speak, he stood before the crowd, Emma sitting in the front row with tears of pride in her eyes, and he told his story. He spoke about losing everything, about the desperation that had driven him to the edge of becoming someone he wasn't, about the choice to ask for help instead of trying to survive by any means necessary. He spoke about the people who had helped him, starting with the volunteer at the intake desk that first night, and extending through everyone who had given him a chance, supported him, believed in him. And then, carefully choosing his words with deliberation, he told them about the moment in the alley that had changed everything. He didn't claim it was supernatural, didn't insist on any particular interpretation, but he described encountering someone who had shown him compassion when he deserved none, who had seen past his desperation to the good man he could still choose to be, who had given him a vision of a different future. He told them about falling to his knees and weeping, about the words that had been spoken to him. "Go and be the man your daughter already thinks you are." That moment, Finn said, his voice thick with emotion even after all these years, saved my life. Not just physically, though it certainly did that. It saved my soul. It saved the person I was, the person I wanted to be, the person my daughter needed me to be. And every day since then, I have tried to be for others what that person was for me. I have tried to see past the circumstances to the human being underneath. I have tried to offer grace instead of judgment, hope instead of condemnation, and a vision of what could be instead of dwelling on what is. The room erupted in applause, but Finn held up a hand, indicating he had more to say. The crowd quieted, leaning forward to hear. "The work we do here," he continued, "is more than just providing beds and meals and job training, though those things are essential. What we really do is remind people that they matter. We tell them, through our actions and our words, that their story isn't over, that they can still choose who they want to be, that one chapter of failure or struggle doesn't define the whole book of their lives. We become echoes of hope in a world that is often too quick to write people off as lost causes." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the piece of dark glass, now worn smooth from years of being carried. He held it up, and as the overhead lights hit it, that familiar star-like pattern burst forth, drawing gasps from the crowd. "This piece of glass," Finn said, "I found in that alley, years after the encounter that changed my life. To most people, it's just a fragment, broken and worthless. But when the light hits it right, it reveals something beautiful, something extraordinary. That's what we do here. We help people find the light inside themselves, the light that was always there but got buried under trauma and hardship and despair. We don't create that light. We just help people see it again." He lowered the glass and looked out at the assembled crowd, at all the faces of people whose lives had been touched by the work of the shelter, by the philosophy of second chances and unconditional dignity that had become its foundation. "So thank you," he said simply. "Thank you for being part of this mission. Thank you for believing that everyone deserves a chance at redemption, and thank you for being echoes of hope in your own right, carrying the light forward to places we haven't reached yet." As the celebration continued around him, Finn found a quiet moment to step outside. The night was cool, with a light breeze that carried the city sounds from the distant streets. He looked up at the sky, where stars were just beginning to appear as the last light of day faded. Emma joined him after a moment, slipping her hand into his the way she used to do when she was a little girl. She was 25 now, confident and capable, but in moments like these she was still his daughter, and he was still her protector. "I'm proud of you, Dad," she said softly. "Not just for what you've accomplished, but for who you are. You could have become bitter about what happened to us, about how hard things were, but instead you turned it into something beautiful." Finn squeezed her hand. "I had good motivation," he said. "A little girl who needed her father to be a hero." Emma leaned her head against his shoulder. "You are my hero," she said. "You always have been. Even in the worst moments, even when we were living in the car and I was scared, I always felt safe because you were there. You never gave up on us." "I came close," Finn admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Closer than you know." "But you didn't," Emma said firmly. "That's what matters. When it counted, you made the right choice. You chose us. You chose hope. And because of that choice, look at all the lives you've changed. Look at all the families who are together tonight because you showed them the same hope someone once showed you." They stood in comfortable silence for a while, father and daughter, watching the stars emerge one by one from the darkening sky. Finn thought about all the paths his life could have taken, all the choices that had led him to this moment. One different decision that night in the alley, and none of this would exist. The shelter wouldn't have a director who truly understood its mission from the inside. Emma might have grown up in foster care, separated from the only parent who loved her. Hundreds of people who had been helped over the years would still be struggling, lost without hope. One moment, one choice, one mysterious encounter that had shown him a different way forward. That was all it had taken to change everything. "Do you ever wonder about her?" Emma asked suddenly, as if reading his thoughts. "The woman from that night?" Finn nodded. "Every day," he admitted. "I've looked for her, hoping to thank her, to tell her what became of the man she saved. But it's like she vanished. Sometimes I think she was never really there, that she was something else, something sent specifically for that moment." "An angel," Emma said, not as a question but as a statement of possibility. "Maybe," Finn agreed, "or maybe just a very kind woman who had the wisdom to see what I needed to hear." "Does it matter?" Emma considered this. "No," she said finally. "I guess it doesn't. The miracle isn't whether she was human or divine. The miracle is that she was there exactly when you needed her, and that you were open enough to hear what she was telling you." "I almost wasn't," Finn said. "I was so far gone, so convinced that I had no other choice. If not for that moment when she spoke, when she showed me compassion instead of fear, I would have done it. I would have taken that purse and run, and my whole life would have been different." "But you didn't," Emma repeated. "And that's the story that matters. That's the story you've shared with hundreds of people, showing them that it's never too late to choose differently, to be better than your circumstances." As they turned to go back inside, Finn took one last look at the stars above. Somewhere in this vast city, maybe even watching the same stars, there might be someone standing on the edge of their own precipice, facing their own moment of desperate choice. He couldn't be there for all of them, couldn't intervene in every life at the exact moment intervention was needed. But through the work of the shelter, through the people he trained and inspired, through the philosophy of grace and second chances that had become the organization's DNA, maybe some of them would find the help they needed. Maybe some of them would hear the echo of the hope that had been given to him. The years continued to pass, and the shelter continued to grow. Finn expanded to multiple locations, each one carrying the same mission and values. He trained other directors, sharing not just administrative skills, but the deeper wisdom about seeing people as they could be, rather than as they appeared in their worst moments. Some of those directors had their own stories of redemption, their own moments when they had been saved from paths that would have destroyed them. Others had never experienced homelessness or desperation, but possessed the empathy and commitment necessary to serve those who had. Finn wrote a book about his experiences, titled Echoes of Hope, Finding Light in the Darkest Alleys. It became a bestseller, not because of its literary merit, but because of the raw honesty with which Finn shared his story and the practical wisdom he had gained about helping people in crisis. The proceeds from the book went directly into the shelter's endowment, ensuring its future long after Finn was gone. He was invited to speak at conferences, to advise city governments on homelessness policy, to consult with other non-profits about effective strategies for serving marginalized populations. Through it all, he remained grounded, never forgetting where he had come from, always carrying that piece of dark glass in his pocket as a tangible reminder of the grace that had been shown to him. On his 60th birthday, Emma organized a surprise celebration at the original shelter location, the one where Finn had first walked through the doors all those years ago with his sick daughter in his arms and desperation in his heart. The building had been renovated and expanded several times since then, but the original intake desk remained, preserved as a kind of historical marker. The party brought together people from every phase of Finn's journey. There was the nurse practitioner who had treated Emma that first night, retired now but still volunteering. There was the warehouse supervisor, who had given Finn his first real job after homelessness, who had taken a chance on a man with nothing but determination and gratitude. There were dozens of people whose lives had been changed by the shelter, some of whom now worked as staff members or volunteers, perpetuating the cycle of help and hope. The original director who had hired Finn was there too, now quite elderly but still sharp and engaged. He pulled Finn aside during the celebration and said, "I knew from the moment I met you that you understood this work in a way most people never could. You didn't come to us with theories or good intentions. You came with experience, with empathy, born from having lived what our clients were living. And you've done more with this organization than I ever dreamed possible." Finn felt tears sting his eyes. "You gave me a chance," he said. "You saw something in me worth investing in. That's what started everything." "No," the old director said, shaking his head gently. "Something started before you ever walked into this building. Something happened to you that made you ready to receive help, that opened your heart to the possibility of change. I just happened to be here when you arrived. The real miracle happened before that, in whatever moment made you choose hope over despair." Finn thought about the alley, about Ilara, about those impossible eyes full of galaxies and grace. "Yes," he said quietly. "Yes, it did." As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, Finn found himself alone in the main hall of the shelter, surrounded by photos on the walls documenting the organization's history. There were pictures of people at their lowest points, and pictures of the same people years later, thriving, smiling, transformed. There were pictures of buildings being renovated, of ribbon-cutting ceremonies for new locations, of awards being received and accolades being given, but the picture Finn's eyes kept returning to was a simple one, taken on his first day as director. He stood in front of the building, his expression a mixture of determination and humility, and above the door behind him was the sign he had seen in his vision that night in the alley: Second Chances Shelter. At the time the photo was taken, Finn hadn't connected it to the vision. It was only later, when he came across the photo while organizing files, that he realized the vision had shown him this exact moment, this exact place. What he had seen in Ilara's eyes hadn't been a vague possibility or a metaphorical future. It had been a specific, concrete reality that was waiting for him if he made the right choices, if he stayed true to the man he was meant to be. That realization had shaken him deeply, confirming what he had always suspected but never been quite certain of. That night in the alley had been something beyond ordinary human experience, a genuine moment of divine intervention or cosmic grace, or whatever term, could encompass an encounter so profound it changed the entire trajectory of a life. Finn reached into his pocket and pulled out the piece of dark glass, holding it up to the light one more time. The familiar starburst pattern emerged, as bright and perfect as always, never dimming despite years of being carried and handled. He smiled, feeling the weight of gratitude settle over him like a warm blanket. "Thank you," he whispered to the empty room, or perhaps to something beyond the room, to whoever or whatever had sent Ilara to that alley on that desperate night. "Thank you for seeing something in me worth saving. Thank you for the grace I didn't deserve. And thank you for the vision that has guided every step since then." The lights of the shelter glowed warmly around him, and from somewhere in the building he could hear the murmur of voices, people finding their way toward hope, toward change, toward their own second chances. The work would continue long after he was gone, carried forward by others who understood that everyone deserves to be seen, to be valued, to be given the opportunity to become who they were meant to be. Finn walked to the main entrance and looked out at the city night. Somewhere out there in the maze of streets and alleys, there were people facing their own moments of desperation, standing at their own crossroads. He couldn't save them all. He couldn't be in every alley at the exact right moment. But through the work he had built, through the philosophy he had established, through the echoes of hope that radiated out from this place, maybe some of them would find their way to help. Maybe some of them would hear the message that it's never too late, that redemption is always possible, that one right choice can change everything. He thought about the blind woman, who could see more than anyone with sight, who had stood unmoved by the wind of his desperation, who had spoken words that had shattered his justifications and revealed the truth of who he was and who he could be. He had never learned her name, never discovered where she had come from or where she had gone. She remained a mystery, a miracle, a moment of grace that had altered the course of his life and, through him, the lives of countless others. Ilara, he said softly, speaking the name he had never spoken aloud, the name he only knew because it had appeared in his mind during that encounter, planted there by means he couldn't explain. Wherever you are, whatever you are, thank you. Thank you for showing me the light when I was lost in darkness. Thank you for believing I was worth saving. And thank you for the vision that has given meaning to every day since. The wind picked up rustling through the trees that lined the street, and for just a moment, Finn could have sworn he heard a voice carried on that wind, faint but clear. You were always worth saving, and you have honored the gift by becoming a gift to others. Well done, my child. Well done. Finn's breath caught in his throat. He looked around, but the street was empty. The voice already faded into the night sounds of the city. Maybe it had been his imagination, or maybe it had been one final message from the mysterious force that had saved him all those years ago. Either way, it filled him with a peace so profound he felt tears streaming down his face. He stood there for a long time watching the city, thinking about the journey that had brought him from that desperate night to this moment of fulfillment and purpose. The path had been long and not always easy. There had been setbacks and challenges, moments of doubt and exhaustion, but there had also been countless moments of joy, of connection, of witnessing transformation, of being part of something larger than himself. This was what redemption looked like. Not a single dramatic moment of change, though that had certainly been part of it, but a sustained commitment to living differently, to choosing hope over despair, to extending grace to others, as grace had been extended to him. It was work, daily work, the kind that didn't come with trumpets or fanfare, but with quiet satisfaction and the knowledge that he was making a difference. Emma found him standing there and slipped her arm through his. "You okay, Dad?" she asked. "Better than okay," Finn said, wiping his eyes. "I was just thinking about how blessed I am. How many people get a second chance at life? How many people get to see the exact moment their story could have gone wrong and then get to live out the version where it went right? I was given a gift, Emma. The greatest gift, and I've spent every day since trying to be worthy of it." "You are worthy of it," Emma said firmly, "and you've more than honored it. Look at what you've built. Look at all the lives you've changed. Dad, you've created a legacy that will outlive both of us. Generations from now, people will still be benefiting from the work you started, from the philosophy you established. That's incredible." Finn shook his head. "I didn't create anything. I just echoed what was shown to me. I just passed on the grace I received. That's all any of us can do, really. Receive the light and reflect it outward. Become echoes of hope for others." They walked back inside together, father and daughter, their footsteps echoing in the quiet hallway. The shelter was settling into its night rhythm, people finding their way to beds, volunteers completing their shifts, the night staff taking over to ensure everyone was safe and cared for through the dark hours. Finn stopped at his office and placed the piece of dark glass back in its display case on his desk. Tomorrow, people would come in for appointments, for counseling, for help navigating the complex systems designed to serve them. Some would be ready to change, eager for the assistance that could turn their lives around. Others would be resistant, still clinging to pride or fear or the belief that they didn't deserve help. Finn would meet them all with the same compassion, the same patience, the same fundamental belief that every person carried within them the potential for transformation. Because he had been both. He had been the man ready to change, walking through the shelter doors with humility and hope. But he had also been the man in the alley, resistant and desperate, convinced that he had no choice but to do something terrible. And if grace could reach him in that darkest moment, if light could penetrate that deepest darkness, then no one was beyond hope. As Finn prepared to leave for the night, he took one last look around his office, at the awards on the walls, at the photos of people whose lives had been changed, at the piece of dark glass that held galaxies within its depths. This was his life's work, his purpose, his calling. And it had all begun with one choice, one moment, one mysterious encounter in a rain-soaked alley. He turned off the lights and walked out, knowing he would return tomorrow to do it all again, to be an echo of hope for whoever needed it, to reflect the light that had been shown to him so many years ago. The work would never be finished, because the need would never disappear. But as long as he had breath, as long as he had the strength, he would continue. He would be the man his daughter thought he was, the man Ilara had seen beneath the desperation, the man he had glimpsed in that cosmic vision. He would be an echo of hope in a world that desperately needed it, and in being that, he would honor the grace that had saved him and continue the legacy of light that had begun in a dark alley on a rainy night, when a desperate thief looked into the eyes of an angel and saw not judgment, but infinite love. The city night embraced him as he walked to his car, and somewhere above, beyond the glow of streetlights and the haze of urban life, the stars shone with that same celestial light he had seen all those years ago, constant and eternal, reminding him that hope, like light, can never truly be extinguished. It can only be shared, reflected, and echoed forward into the lives of others, creating ripples of transformation that spread far beyond what any one person can see or measure. And so Finn continued his work, day after day, year after year, an echo of the hope that had saved him, a reflection of the grace that had transformed him, and a living testament to the truth that it is never too late to choose light over darkness, redemption over destruction, and love over despair. His story, like the piece of glass he carried, appeared broken and ordinary on the surface, but when the light hit it just right, it revealed something extraordinary, something beautiful, something that proved that even in the darkest alleys of life, miracles are possible. This is the story of Finn, the desperate man who almost became a thief, but chose to become a beacon instead. This is the story of Ilara, the mysterious woman who saw with more than eyes and saved with more than words. And this is the story of hope, proving that it can be found in the most unexpected places, carried by the most unlikely people, and can transform not just one life, but hundreds, thousands, countless souls who needed only to be reminded that they matter, that they're seen, and that their story isn't over yet. What would you do when you face your darkest moment? Would you have the courage to choose hope when despair seems so much easier? Would you recognize grace when it appears in unexpected forms? These are questions we all must answer in our own ways, in our own times. But let Finn's story remind you that the choice is always there, that redemption is always possible, and that sometimes the most profound miracles come not with thunder and lightning, but with quiet words spoken in a rain-soaked alley by someone who sees the truth of who we are and who we can become. If this story has touched your heart, if you believe in the power of second chances and the possibility of transformation, then share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Leave a comment telling us about a time when someone showed you grace when you didn't deserve it, or when you were able to be that grace for someone else. Subscribe to our channel so you never miss stories like this, stories that remind us of the light that exists even in the darkest places, the hope that persists even in the most desperate moments, and the love that can transform us when we're brave enough to receive it. Remember, you are not defined by your worst moments, your biggest mistakes, or your deepest despair. You are defined by the choices you make when you're given a chance to change, and that chance is always available, always waiting, always possible. Be an echo of hope in someone else's life today, and watch as that hope ripples outward, creating transformation beyond anything you can imagine. Because that's what grace does. It doesn't just save one person. It creates a legacy of light that continues long after the initial moment has passed, touching lives in ways we'll never fully know, but that matter more than we can possibly measure.